Hi, welcome to session two of the seventh topic of the semester, Modernity in Progress Comes to Texas. And we're looking at a period of time, roughly speaking, starting from 1876 onwards. We're going to actually be moving into the early 20th century, by the way. This is, again, a transition stage for Texas, for the state of Texas, in which the state was now transforming the economy. The economy was, becoming more commercial oriented. There were industries being developed, a wage labor economy, people working for wages and the like. As a market economy, people producing for the market as well. And the way people live is going to change dramatically. This is something that we're going to actually see in this session. Actually, this transitioning towards modernity, which occurred, once again, roughly speaking, starting around 1876, 1877. That is the end of Reconstruction. So after Reconstruction comes to an end, now we're going to see a new Texas, so to speak. Okay, a new Texas society, a new Texas economy is becoming more modern. But in the first session, what we were doing is actually going over the idea of modernity, defining modernity and trying to pretty much understand what it entails for a society to modernize. If we're going to be paying attention to Texas, for example, modernizing, so we have to have a good grasp, a good understanding of what is modernization. And again, we explained in session one that this is something that some nations are actually undergoing during the late 19th century. The United States, of course, is one of those nations, the pioneers, again, of the modern nations of the world. American society is actually transforming very rapidly in the 19th century, and it is really after Reconstruction, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, that those areas of the United States that had not yet modernized, such as the South and the West, the so-called Wild West, those regions are also going to undergo dramatic transformations in the way people live and the way people do work, and they're going to modernize as well. Okay. So the United States is undergoing this process. Texas is now part of the United States, of course. So it is going to experience radical change in the economic structures and the ways that people actually engage in work, for example, the way that people live. We're going to see, of course, the rise of big cities as well, large urban centers and the like. And so Texas will be part of this process, by the late 19th century and early 20th century, by the way. So we're not going to stop exactly at 1900. We're actually going to look at some initial years of the 20th century, because again, there's, of course, still this process of change, this process of modernization is also accelerating very rapidly in the very initial years of the 1900s. So we're also going to be paying attention to the early 20th century, very early, by the way. Okay. So, as I said, it's important to understand what modernity is. Okay. So we were trying to define it, in session one, by really looking at what is modern, for example. So we were looking at modernity, the definition as something that was new. Okay. This is something that comes about in the 1700s in Europe. The European philosophers, the scientists, the mathematicians, the physicists, the engineers, etc. They began to innovate, new technologies, new tools that are going to assist people in their work, so work can be done much faster and better. Machines, for example, the coming of the machine age we were talking about, and how those innovations were labeled as modern, because again, modernity itself was actually a word that the simple definition is simply something new. Again, something that was new, different from the ways of the past, the ways that people work, the ways that people actually thought about the world, etc. Again, all of that past was something that modernity rejected. In other words, that what was modern was something new that was going to actually create a better future for humanity, a better future. So there's again an inherent belief in modernity about this search for a better future. The idea of progress, that is to say, that that one of the reasons, again, for human beings to be on Earth is to innovate, to really come up with new ideas, new tools, more sophisticated ways of working and thinking and researching, and that are going to all of them come together in order to create a better society, the ideal world, the ideal existence for the future, in which people are going to live better, happier. They're going to be producing products much faster than ever before because there's going to be new technologies, and technologies have to be improving every year over time, constant innovation, constant improvement, and so on, in order to actually create this ideal existence in which our technologies are the ones working for us. They're the ones actually producing the products that we actually need to survive and to provide all the products, all the materials that we actually require for our daily work, for our daily living. So again, this idea of modernity was deeply associated with the new, the cult of the new, whether it's a scientific idea, whether it's a theory of science, whether it's a piece of technology, okay, a new idea about society, etc. That was modern, okay? So we were defining that, and we were actually trying to actually provide examples, of modernity. In other words, all right, so what actually happened ever since the 1700s that allowed certain societies to modernize? What were they doing? What exactly entailed to modernize, to become new? In other words, to become new. Because that's exactly what modernity is, to become new. And so we were looking at, again, the scientific, for example, and technological revolution. The advent of new technologies, for example, machinery, things like the steam engine, railroads, steamship, weaving machines, for example, electricity, telecommunication systems, and the like. Again, the telephone, the telegraph, for example, agricultural technologies, and so on, tractors, fertilizers, irrigation systems, and the like. Again, all of that, again, it was really what societies were using in order to transform their economies. They were now using machinery, in other words, to produce whatever needed to be produced. It is the mechanization of production. Machinery is now being used in order to produce whatever, again, from clothing and shoes, everything that people consume, even food, is going to be produced by, again, tractors, machinery, and so on. Again, we were talking about that quite extensively. Now, again, in this session, we're going to just cover, some also additional features of modernity. In other words, what also entailed for societies to modernize. What does it mean? Okay, the meanings of modernity. What does it mean to modernize? Okay, so let's turn to our slide now and look at also the rise of modern industries and enterprises. Okay, because with the coming of new technologies, with this technological revolution that I just was mentioning, again, that spanned, roughly speaking, between 1750 and 1900, even though those are not clear-cut, exact dates, but this is, again, a kind of tentative timeline for the first technological revolution of the modern era. With the advent of new technologies, we're going to see also the rise of new industries, new enterprises, again, and those are the enterprises that are actually using the new technologies. So all of those new technologies that we discussed in session 1 at the end of session one are going to be used in enterprises in which people are going to work there for wages. Again, it's a wage labor economy, and they're going to be operating those machines in the production of goods, material goods, consumer goods. Okay, so here we just have to understand that this nations, the society that are modernizing, they're creating new enterprises. That is also another feature of a modern society. That modern societies are societies that undergo industrialization. Okay, they give rise to industries, to factories, mining industries as well, agricultural companies, etc. So here we're just going to just list again the most important industries that are going to be on the rise in the United States that were part of the first and second industrial revolutions. Again, talking about the first and the second industrial revolutions. And we're going to see that that was part of modernization. That societies that modernize have an industrial base, a manufacturing base, and they have a host of different enterprises that are the ones that are using the technologies that we mentioned and for the production of commercial products, again, consumer goods and the like. Okay, and as the machinery is now engaged in the production, people are still operating the machines, but machines are the ones actually, again, producing those products. So just rather quickly, again, what the United States is actually experiencing ever since 1816, by the way, 1816 is like the starting date of the first industrial revolution in the United States. And that spanned all the way to, roughly speaking, 1850, thereabouts, the first industrial revolution, with textile manufacturing. Okay, textile manufacturing. Textiles means clothing. Okay, those were weaving machines, that were weaving cotton, particularly cotton fiber, into finished clothing. Okay, textiles, that is to say. Okay, so this is the first, consumer product of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. What factories were actually doing, again, during the first Industrial Revolution in the United States is, again, manufacturing clothing, textile manufacturing. And again, then of course there's going to be a disruption there, in 1860, 1865, the Civil War kind of put a hold to the Industrial Revolution, so to speak, not necessarily, but it's not going to boom necessarily during the Civil War itself. Not until the Civil War was over and we go into the process of Reconstruction. So it's really, almost immediately after the Civil War, by 1865, that we're going to see a second wave of industrialization in the United States, the so-called Second Industrial Revolution. And with the Second Industrial Revolution, we're going to see the advent of new industries, new enterprises, okay, in the United States. For example, the steel and the railroad industries, okay? There's going to be massive railroad construction, particularly at the end of the Civil War. Starting around the end of the Civil War, the railroad is going to go everywhere. It's not just the North. The North is really well developed, has a very modern system of transportation, has canals, steamships, it has railroads, etc., over 22,000 miles of tracks, etc., the North. But after the Civil War, the railroad is going to come to the South to develop railroad lines across the South. It's going to come into Texas, and it's also going west as well, the so-called Wild West. Okay, and so there's going to be massive railroad construction. So therefore, we're going to see also the rise of steel industry that was actually manufacturing the raw materials, the products that the railroads require, like iron and steel for the tracks, the wagons, etc. Again, there's going to be a steel industry on the rise in the United States, and railroad industries, again, industries that were manufacturing wagons, locomotives, steam engines, and the like as well. And they were also engaged in the building of the railroad itself. Okay, so again, this is part of the second industrial revolution. After the Civil War, there's a second wave of industrialization, and we're going to see the rise of new industries like the steel, railroad industries, and with it, we also have to talk about, when we talk about, for example, steel and railroad industries, we do have to talk about mining, because they go hand in hand. Because in order to manufacture steel, you need to smelt the iron ore. And to smelt the iron ore, we will require coal. Okay, so there was going to be significant exploration taking place in the United States in order to find coal. There was large coal deposits, by the way, found in the United States. We're going to see mining companies mining for coal, but also mining for iron ore. Okay, so there's going to be also iron ore found in the South as well. You know, places like Alabama, for example, there's going to be a huge discovery of iron ore in Birmingham, Alabama. And again, this is going to lead to the steel industry and also the coal mining and iron ore industry as well in the South, in places like Alabama as well. Again, so this is part of the second industrial revolution. That is going to be really transforming the South as well. You know, the rural agricultural South is now entering the age of industry, is modernizing, in other words. Okay, some people are hired, of course, to do work for wages. Again, this is also something new in the South, people working for wages as well. Okay, wage labor. Another industry that is going to be on the rise, and this is something that we're going to see in Texas particularly, because Texas is going to be at the forefront of this industry. That's the oil industry, okay, which already existed in the latter part of the 19th century, but there was not really a huge demand for oil prior to the coming of the, let's say, the automobile in the 20th century. Oil was used for industrial processes. It was used for oil lamps. So before even the age of electricity, again, people use oil lamps, etc. So yeah, there was a demand for this resource, this energy resource. But as we'll see, Texas, particularly in the 1890s, okay, 1894, 1896, is going to enter this age of oil production. And there's going to be significant deposits of oil discovered in Texas, the most important in 1901, something we're going to talk about, of course, much later in this topic. And we're going to see the rise of an oil industry as well in the United States. And this is going to, as we'll see, particularly in Texas, this is going to transform the state forever. Again, the discovery of oil and the rise of oil industry. Okay, so this is very important. This is part of the second industrial revolution. You know, that is really modernizing the American economy and is going to modernize the state economy of Texas, most particularly, and this is something we're going to see more carefully here. There's going to be also electrical companies. Okay, there's going to be companies that are going to be generating electricity, and they're going to provide a service and sell electricity to cities. And now homes are going to have electricity to power up their homes. There's going to be artificial lighting. We call it, the coming of the light bulb. We mentioned in session 1, the light bulb, and, city parks, are going to be offices, businesses, and the like. And of course, electrical companies will be yet another industry that is going to be generating the electricity now for the modern cities. This is what entails to be modern as well, is that you got electrical companies, you got electricity, and you got artificial light now being used by the modern societies. Okay, and this is going to be so important, really, to understand modernity, that electricity is going to be the life force of the modern age. Without electricity, our technologies are not going to work. Okay, so all of the innovation, all of the technologies that we innovate, that we bring about every year, that are supposed to be improving and getting better, more sophisticated, they all are powered by electricity. Okay, so this is very important. There's going to be now electrical companies on the rise as well. Okay, There's going to be chemical industries as well. Those are in the growing industries, whether it was the oil industry, for example, textile manufacturing, electricity. There's going to be a requirement again for certain chemicals, and those are produced, manufactured, created again in chemical plants. Okay, and they're going to be selling chemicals again to other industries, as well. Later on, the chemical plants are also going to be involved in the creation of detergents and the like of many industrial products, for cleaning and the like, etc. Again, so there's also, again, chemical plants, chemical industries as well in the second industrial revolution. There's also going to be pharmaceutical industries are also on the rise. Pharmaceuticals, of course, medicine, in other words. Now, back in the 19th century, late 19th century, those were not really well developed the way we see them today. Okay, they're now corporations, for example. Well, back then, there were companies. Many of them actually employed chemists, if you will, in order to, come up with medicine or, treatments and the like, syrups. That people, it was so common to drink syrups back during the late 19th century for all sorts of ailments. Okay, stomach pains, migraine headaches, etc. People, drank syrups, and those were produced by the pharmaceuticals in many cases. There were many other people actually produce their own syrups at home, homemade, if you will, and will sell them in the local store in their own cities and towns. And so there was no regulation of pharmaceuticals back then. But this is part of also of a new industry, so to speak. And there are, of course, scientists, chemists that are actually hired there to be innovating new technologies, new medicines and pills and the like. Again, this is going to be another area where the new enterprises are employing the new technologies, the new science, so to speak. Okay. As well, there's going to be yet another, and this is again very important, another industry that is going to be tied to the Texas economy, and that is the beef industry. Okay. The beef industry. Now, the beef industry, as we'll see, it was really a conglomeration of many types of industries. Okay, when we talk about the beef industry, it's not just one single, monolith, like a single unit, if you will, in which everybody works in this particular industrial plant, but rather the beef industry entailed so many different enterprises. Okay, that were part of this conglomerate, if you will. For example, cattle ranching. Okay, even though cattle ranchers are pretty much operating very much on their own independently in places like Texas, particularly, but also in Kansas, in Colorado as well, they were tied to the beef industry because, again, they were producing the cattle that is going to be transported to a slaughterhouse. That's another enterprise. The slaughterhouse is going to become an industry in its own right. Okay, so cattle ranchers are the ones producing cattle. They're sending the cattle to a slaughterhouse, which is another enterprise. The cattle is being slaughtered and is being packaged. So there's also a meat packaging plants. Sometimes the slaughterhouses are the meat packers, sometimes they're not. So the meat packaging plants might be yet another industry, another enterprise that is part of this larger beef industry. Okay, so there's so many different enterprises that are tied together, if you will. Okay, there's like a certain network that they depend on each other. There's some cattle ranchers are the producers, others are the slaughterers of the cattle, and others package it, and so on again. And there's also distribution centers and so on. So there's supermarkets, meat markets, and so on. It's this large complex, if you will. So we're going to talk about that down the line, about the cattle ranchers, the industrial cattle ranchers in Texas. And that's exactly what is going to happen is that cattle ranchers, what is called cattle ranching itself, that kind of commercial enterprise is going to become more industrialized. Okay, it will be an industrial operation. It is going to really undergo significant change Whereas, for example, when you look at cattle ranching before the second industrial revolution, it was really, again, a kind of a small type of enterprise owned by an individual or owned by a family for a regional market. But now, what we're going to see in the late 19th century is that beef, cattle ranching, again, is now going to produce for the national market. For the national market, not just for the regional market, but for the national market. So the significance, again, of all of those industries that I just outlined is that they're part of this modernization wave, this modernization process. It's massive industrialization taking place. New industries are on the rise, and now more and more people are working for industries that, in the past, again, before the Industrial Revolution, because there were no factories, because there were no industries, people were engaged in something called subsistence work. Subsistence, in other words, and we talked about that in session one, is that people were simply subsisting from their work. Growing their own food, for example, maybe selling a surplus of that food and trading it or bartering it for other products that they needed. And if there was a commercial economy, it was very, very limited, very confined to a region. Cattle ranchers often just produce cattle for, for their own locality, for a series of communities around the enterprise, the cattle ranch, etc. It was a very regional economy. But now, again, this subsistence economy in which people were simply subsisting from work or simply just engaging in very small scale commercial activity. This is now this type of economic organization, again, of the past is going to really start to disappear gradually, particularly in a more accelerated rate in the second industrial revolution, because what people are actually doing is that they're migrating to the cities and they're actually taking on jobs, on those industries. Now, the way people are going to earn their living is by the payment of wages, okay? Earning wages, that is to say, okay? They're going to get hired in the industries I just mentioned, okay? And they're going to live in the city. They're going to actually sustain themselves and their families, from wages, that is to say, as opposed to be, subsisting from their own work, like an artisan or a farmer, etc. They're still there, farmers, artisans, but again, more and more people are moving again to cities. There's a massive migrations taking place. Okay, so those industries, they were gigantic in size in their operations, in the scope of their operations, that they were hiring now thousands of workers. Any industrial plant hire anywhere between 800 people all the way to 4,000. Just one factory, for example, or one industrial plant will have thousands of workers, being employed there, earning wages. So there is not only an economic transformation in which the way people work is changing, because now the enterprises are actually the one producing the products, the consumer goods with the new technologies, but also the way people live. People are actually moving to the cities and they're now sustaining themselves with, again, wages, salaries, okay? So again, this is called modernization. This is a modern economy now, okay? A modern economy is now on the rise, okay? Also, what's also very interesting to note here, again, is that the new enterprises, again, that are going to be on the rise, also entailed agricultural enterprises, not just industries or manufacturing plants, etc. Okay, so part of this wave of new industries and new enterprises that was part of this modernization project, okay, that the United States is undergoing, also entail giving rise to farming and agricultural companies. Okay, so again, the farming and agriculture is going to also commercialize. In other words, it's going to become a commercial enterprise. Once again, is people are gradually moving away from what's called subsistence farming okay, simply growing their own food, subsisting from the land, growing whatever food they're growing, etc., to now produce for the market. Okay, people are going to now transform the way they see the land, and instead of just seeing the land as simply the place from which they are simply subsisting, growing their own food, that they're going to see it as an enterprise. Okay, that this piece of land that I have, that I own, it can be a business. Okay, I'm actually going to turn it into a business in its own right. And this is done by small farmers as well as by investors. There's going to be merchants, investors that have large, sums of money, that have capital, and what they're going to do is buy large tracts of land for the purpose of growing food on a massive scale, like an industrial type of production, in order to sell it in the market again and build a company. In other words, this is not just a small commercial farm, but rather this is an agricultural company. Okay, so those are again owned by investors. That is to say, people that have capital, that are going to invest in land, invest in technology, and they're going to simply grow cash crops. Again, this is called cash crop agriculture. In other words, what you want to do is use the land to make money. So therefore, you have to grow crops that are valuable in the market, that there's a demand for them, in other words. Okay, so it's called cash crop agriculture. So even farming and agriculture is undergoing significant transformation. It's modernizing because now, again, people are simply now using, of course, the land to, for business purposes. They want to make money, that is to say. We see the rise of both commercial farms, okay, as I mentioned. Even a small farmer is actually transforming the farm that was traditionally owned by a family into a commercial farm. It's a business now. It's a business venture, in other words. And they're also going to, we're also going to see the rise of what is called agribusiness. Okay, so an agribusiness, that's exactly what an agricultural company is. An agricultural company. Again, those are investors that are buying hundreds and hundreds of acres, and they're going to move in technology there, tractors, etc., because they have capital, in other words. And this is an entire, business venture as well for them. So they're going to actually grow on a massive scale. Again, this is the era of mass production. Things like wheat, for example, corn, cotton, vegetables, citrus, again, because there's a growing demand for those products. And so this is a business, in other words. Again, it's an agribusiness, in other words. So again, this is also part of this modernization trend. That it's not just the rise of industries, but even farming itself, the traditional way of living, the traditional way of doing work, which was traditionally in the past simply people growing their own food. This is going to turn into a business venture. Okay, so at any rate, so again, so with that, again, now let's move into the rise of modern industrial cities. Okay, the rise of modern industrial cities, because as I mentioned, with the rise of new enterprises, with the rise of new industries, with the rise of agricultural companies and the like, and the new technologies, etc., there's going to be now people moving on such a vast scale again to those cities. Something that is going to also happen to Texas, by the way. Texas will attract, once it begins, this process of industrialization is going to attract thousands and thousands of peoples migrating into the state. Some of them are coming from the United States. Others are going to be coming from places like Mexico as well. And others are going to be coming from places from around the world. Again, foreign immigration, that is to say. Okay, so it is really the Industrial Revolution that begins, particularly the second industrial revolution that begins, roughly speaking, after the end of the Civil War, that really caused a phenomenon in the United States, a phenomenon known as global migrations. Okay, so this is part of the modern era. When the modern age begins with the rise of this high-tech industrial civilization, that as a consequence of this new industrial civilization with advanced technologies, the nations, the societies that were undergoing those changes attracted people from all over the world, whether we're talking about the European nations that were industrializing or whether we're talking about the United States, that despite that fact, okay, that some of them are in Europe or some of in the United States, the leading industrial societies in the late 19th century really were like magnets that attracted literally, again, millions of people to those nations because there was a need for work. There was scarcity of labor, that those nations, those societies were not meeting. So in order to actually meet the demand for labor in the growing industries, because we're seeing massive industrialization taking place, or in the agricultural companies, for example, that we mentioned, the agribusiness, there was a need for labor. So that led to the need for actually, inviting, in many cases, foreign immigration, people coming from many parts of the world in order to actually, be hired in those industries, that is to say. So again, there's going to be a massive movements of people, again, from around the world, again, global migrations, again. This is a phenomenon of the modern age, by the way. And once we go into the 20th century and we examine the 20th century, this is going to be a central theme, by the way, of the 20th century, global migrations. Again, still, going on even today. This is part of this ever-changing world in which certain nations attract labor because they have enterprises, because they have a need for, in many cases, cheap labor. And so there's going to be people that will be willing to take those jobs coming from different countries, in other words. Okay, so in the United States, of course, what we see is that many people who were previously just simply working the land, farmers, for example, are going to be migrating to the cities. Again, people that were simply simple farmers that were simply growing their own food, they're simply going to leave that life, that livelihood, and they're going to be migrating now to the city to take on those jobs. And of course, immigrants, many immigrants, of course, that are coming to Texas, that are coming to the United States during this period of time are also coming from peasant societies in many cases. They were previously peasants. They believed that there was no future for them in that life anymore. So they decided to simply leave that life, the peasantry, and migrate to, the United States. And there's, of course, significant numbers of people coming from Mexico into Texas during this period of time, of course. Okay, so at any rate, so with now more and more people coming into the cities in search for work, those cities are going to now grow and, of course, transform. That the societies, again, of those modern nations that we're talking about, in this case, the United States, are going to really reshape the way that people live and that people group together. Because now we're going to see, for example, social classes, the emergence of social classes. This is going to be really, really common again in the modern age, that we're now going to see, of course, social classes. For example, the industrial working class. Okay, those are the people that work in those factories, for example. They're the ones operating the machines. They work in the coal mines, in the iron ore mines, etc. Again, so they are becoming a class into themselves. Again, that is the industrial working class. This is the social landscape, the new social landscape of the cities, that we have this industrial working class, of course. And also we're going to see the rise of a middle class. Okay. The middle class are those people that are the professionals and the managers, and they're going to get paid more because they have skills. It's called skilled labor, that is to say, because they receive training in colleges and universities. They have degrees in engineering and science, in accounting, bookkeeping, management, etc. Again, chemistry and the like, they're going to be hired and paid more for their labor because they have skills, they have knowledge, and because they get paid more, they're going to create a different social status for themselves. They're going to become part of the middle class. They're going to, in many cases, own their own homes. They're going to send their children to school, etc. They read newspapers and they are paying attention to the events taking place around them in the political sphere, in the economic sphere. They're the ones that are very, fond of art appreciation, for example. So therefore, this is something that we're going to see in the cities is, again, the development of art museums, for example. There's going to be theaters, opera, etc., where people appreciate, of course, a piece of art or a display of art, etc. There's going to be, of course, the center for which people are doing the research. There's research centers as well. Okay, the scientists are conducting their experiments, their research, and this is also the city itself, the place where people actually produce scientific achievements. Okay, scientific theories are developed, scientific knowledge is being innovated, and so on. Again, in the cities. And of course, the arts and the sciences are being transmitted from generation to generation in the city through a system of public education and universities as well. Okay, so the public education and universities, this is something that the cities are bringing about, the new modern industrial cities. Are the ones that are really attempting to raise the education level of the population so the population can be trained, can be ready to innovate, that they're trying to create the new scientists of the future, the people that are going to be coming up with new cures for diseases, new treatments, for example, those that are going to bring, new machinery, for example, okay, that are going to innovate technology or industry and the like, okay. So it's important to train the new generations in a public education system, and of course, also to foster centers for higher learning, universities, that is to say. So again, the future generations will be far more educated than the past generations, because that's the idea of progress. You need to progress, and the only way to progress is through knowledge. The more knowledge we accumulate, the more knowledge that we transmit to the future generations, the more we arrive to this ideal existence, that is to say. So this is another, again, a feature of the modern cities that are on the rise, that are part of, once again, they're really part and parcel of this modernizing project. So, in sum, so far, what we have actually talked about so far in session 1 and part of this session 2 is, trying to understand modernity. We started out with definitions, etc., the cult of the new, the search for a better future, and there are certain values that people, of course, are considering new, that are supposed to be better than the values of the past, like individualism. We talked about that, competitiveness, materialism, for example, consumerism, a change. We talked about that people value that, the development of the individual, the search for happiness in this material world, to value material conditions, material wealth, material comforts, to be competitive. In other words, that's the way that individuals improve themselves, to be, competing with one another, consuming goods and services. That's the way individuals achieve happiness, etc. And this eternal process of change that modern societies value so much, that we're supposed to be changing and progressing for the better every time, every year, as we go along, that we're improving ourselves as well. Okay, so once again, the features of the modern age. This is something that Texas is going to now experience, starting, roughly speaking, 1876 onwards. Is that Texas is now going very gradually going to be adopting certain values, again, that are part of the features of the modern age, the cult of the new and progress. There's going to be a gradual shift towards, again, abandoning tradition, pretty much turning away from the past, from the way people thought, lived, and, acquire new modes of thought to value everything that is new. Okay, if there's a new technology, there's a new industry, a new type of enterprise, etc., new styles of dress, new fashion, etc. People are going to start gradually be moving again in this new direction. People also are going to value science and technology, as we'll see in Texas. This is part of the features of the modern age again. The idea that science and technology are going to be the tools that will allow human beings to solve problems in the natural world as well as in the social world, and to create a better existence. Again, that science and technology are going to save us, in other words, from all of the problems of the past, from all of the afflictions, from epidemics, for example, from natural calamities, catastrophes, etc. That humans are going to be able to understand how nature works and really come up with an idea, a piece of tool, a technology in order to solve whatever problem arises, for example. Okay, for example, irrigation systems. Okay, why wait for rain if there's going to be droughts, affecting farmers, and instead of being afflicted by those droughts, that you can just simply bring technology. You can just bring electricity, water pumps, you water your crops with technology, and you solve that problem. Okay, technology is going to solve the problem of droughts, for example. It's just an example. Okay, so again, this is something that Texas is going to move into, as we'll see, as Texas is moving into this new modern age. Capitalist enterprises as well, factories, mining, agriculture, and of course, large industrial cities. All of those we're going to actually now see in this second part that we're starting now with understanding now Texas itself. Texas transitioning towards modernity, that is to say. Now, again, we already looked at modernity. What is modernity? What entails to modernize? The modernizing project, that is to say. Now, let's look at Texas. How Texas is moving now towards this new economy, this new society. Okay. All right. So let's look at part two. Okay. So now we're just going to focus on Texas. We understand what modernity is. So now let's look at this change taking place. And once again, it's gradual. This is not to say that Texas is suddenly going to rapidly modernize and, within a few years or perhaps a few decades, is going to look like the industrialized states of the Northeast, like New York, for example, okay, or Pennsylvania, or New England, for example, okay, that has been in this path for quite a while, for most of the 19th century. So they're very advanced. The North, the industrialized North, is way, way advanced. It's way, way, more high tech, industrialized, in other words. It has already, kind of become this high tech industrial civilization, become part of that. Relatively speaking, compared, let's say, to Texas or compared to any of the states of the South, the North is way more, ahead of this process. So Texas is going to now enter this process and is going to do it, quite gradually, but it is very steady. The changes taking place in Texas are very, very steady. And every year, every decade, there's significant change taking place in Texas is attempting to modernize as well, okay, in its own rhythm. if you will. Okay, so let us look at this transition now, okay, towards modernity. We start with, first and foremost, transportation systems, okay? This is important. Before we talk about, the industries, we're going to mention some industries here, manufacturing, etc. Um, it is extremely important to take into account that without modern transportation systems, it's very difficult to modernize. As a matter of fact, this is an essential step. Perhaps one of the first early stages of modernization is that the system of transportations have to be upgraded, because once you start building enterprises, the producers are now really integrating the new technologies, etc. You got factories and the like. How is it that the raw materials, the resources, or the finished products are going to be transported? From the mine to the factory, for example, or from the factory to the marketplace. Okay, if you don't have a viable, a very upgraded system of transportation. So transportation systems are essential for any society that is attempting to modernize. You need good roads, for example. You need navigation systems, ports, for example, ships as well. You need bridges. And in this case, what is really going to allow Texas to enter the modern age once and for all will be the railroads, okay? The development of the railroads. It's crucial, okay? The development of transportation systems, again, is going to pave the road now, so, almost literally, again, for the growth, for the expansion of industries, factories, enterprises of all kinds, okay, in Texas. Because now you got transportation, okay? So the development of the railroads, by the way, really was part of a larger process that the United States is undergoing, okay? So this is not an isolated process that Texas is simply endeavoring to accomplish, but rather that Texas is simply part of a larger whole that the United States is actually attempting as a whole, to provide transportation facilities, to provide transportation systems and networks virtually to all the states, to all the regions of the country, and to tie the country together commercially by tying the states together with, of course, the system of transportation to make interstate commerce and trade faster and easier, but also to allow producers, local producers, to have access to the national market. So wherever you are, whether you're, a cattle rancher, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a manufacturer, for example, whether you own a mine, like a copper mine, silver mine, iron ore, etc., doesn't matter. Okay, that you're going to have access, to send your product all over the country. Okay, so the people that will be consuming your product, despite the fact that you're located, let's say in East Texas or South Texas, that your product might be consumed all over the country. Might be consumed in the Northeast, for example. Might be consumed in the Midwest. You're going to have consumers, in other words. That's what a market is. You're going to have consumers all over the country. Okay, so there's going to be now a national economy on the rise, and part of the reason why the United States is now developing a national economy is because it's developing a national transportation system, the railroads, that is to say. So the building of the railroads was part of this process of connecting the states together and allowing producers, local producers, to have access to the national market. Okay, so to send products all over the country, in other words. So again, the idea with this project of building the railroads really emerged in the midst of the U.S. Civil War. Okay, it is precisely around 1862 when the Lincoln administration, again, Abraham Lincoln in the North, the Union, was attempting to link the Western territories with the East there was still a lot of land, particularly, the Great Plains of the United States, that had not yet been settled, by the way. And all of this territory in the West, the so-called Wild West, was not necessarily fully integrated with the rest of the country. And so this process of integration, okay, required really linking those two regions, the East and the West, together. And of course, the railroad was going to be that means to actually build the railroad all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And there's going to be, of course, 4 projects that they're going to create to build a railroad all over to the Pacific Ocean, from coast to coast, from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast in the Pacific Ocean, in order to bring that region, the Western territories, together with the East, okay, to link them together commercially. The purpose is we need to integrate the resources of the West. There's going to be significant resources discovered in the West that are going to be processed and manufactured in the East, where the industries are located. And so it was required again that we have a modern system of transportation to transport those raw materials, again, back to the East Coast. And of course, in 1862, Lincoln and Congress issued what is called the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, and creating the Pacific Railroads, that is to say, that they're going to be commissioned to build specific lines all the way to the West Coast. There's going to be 4 Pacific Railroads, by the way. There was an act of Congress, by the way. This is an act of Congress in which it gave a charter to 4 different companies, each with a project to build a rail line all the way to the Pacific Coast, to the Pacific Ocean. So again, those 4 Pacific Railroads were the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, Central Pacific, and Southern Pacific. Okay, and the idea, again, this is part of this process of change that we're talking about, this modernization process, to upgrade the transportation systems, link the West with the East, and facilitate producers to actually send their products, again, all over the country as well. So many of the rail lines, by the way, are going to be tapping into mining sectors. They're going to be tapping into farming communities as well. Okay, so the rail lines are not just built randomly, but rather they're going to be tapping into areas that were known to be settled or occupied by producers, entrepreneurs, etc. Mining industries of all kinds, agricultural companies, cattle ranchers, etc. So again, those products can be shipped to the cities, particularly. Again, so we got the Northern Pacific, that is the Northern Line, again, across the north. And the Union and the Central Pacific were cutting through the midsection of the United States. The Central Pacific was actually coming from the west to the east, whereas the Union Pacific was actually moving from the east west. And they were going to actually meet at some point in 1867. And the Southern Pacific is going to build a rail line across the south, moving into Texas, again, across Texas, going along the border with Mexico, and pretty much building a line in the border with Mexico on the U.S. side, of course, all the way to California, okay, the Southern Pacific. And the Southern Pacific is going to play a key role, as we'll see, with the building of the railroad in Texas. Okay, there's going to be an independent, of course, company there in Texas, but the Southern Pacific is also going to come in and assist this Texas company building the railroad. And so it's essential, again, to build those railroads. So this is a national project that is not really, again, a project that Texas is engaged in total isolation, but rather this is a larger process, again, of modernization. And of course, Texas is now going to be building railroads, particularly towards the end of Reconstruction. That was part of the agreement, by the way, that for the South in the presidential election of 1877, There was a presidential election that was a contested election, by the way, in which the South nominated Samuel Tilden for the presidency, and apparently, according to the South, Tilden received more votes. Okay, so therefore won the election. So that was a contested election because the Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes also contested the election and the results. And of course, that is going to affect the crisis in the United States and pretty much send the United States into another crisis. And the great compromise of 1877 was that the Southerners were willing to accept defeat and concede again to the Republican Hayes, again, the presidency, among other things, is that they wanted a railroad. They issued several petitions, but one of those petitions is, we want a new railroad, that is to say. Okay, so that was part of the agreement anyways, that after Reconstruction, the agreement is that there will be railroad development, in other words, in the South, in Texas, including Texas as well. Okay, so Texas is going to give rise to one particular railroad company that was chartered to build a railroad in Texas. The Texas and Pacific Railroad, it was called the T&P. The initials, again, the T&P was simply the initials of this particular railroad company that was commissioned to build rail lines across Texas. And later on, the Southern Pacific is also going to come in and also develop some railroads as well. But the Texas and Pacific Railroad was particularly the company that was responsible, that was chartered by the Texas government to build rail lines in Texas. Okay, so this is again after Reconstruction, starting around 1876, and to incentivize the railroad company, okay, to build the railroad. This is something that actually the U.S. government actually did too with the Pacific Railroad that we just mentioned, is again that to incentivize the railroads to build the railroads across the West, is that Texas, as well as the U.S. government, actually, of course, granted land to the railroads. There were land grants. This is very similar, again, to the ways that Texas in the past, if you go back to the earlier topics when we talk about colonization, for example, okay, the land contracts, that, for example, Texas will award land to an empresario to bring settlers to colonize Texas, to incentivize, the empresarios, the colonization agents, to actually bring a lot of families, for example, okay, give them land. Okay, and they're going to actually colonize the region to develop the region. So likewise, this is similar. It's a similar pattern that Texas is attempting also to incentivize the railroad companies to build the railroad as quickly as possible by granting land. Okay, so this is a law passed by Texas in 1876 called simply the Land Grant of 1876, in which actually it gave the railroad companies 2 miles of land on each side, per track of mile that they built, in other words. So wherever the railroad was built, 2 miles on each side was actually given to the railroad company. And so railroad companies are going to become large landowners again in this process. The Pacific railroads, again, as well as the Texas railroads, are going to be now acquiring, astronomical numbers of, acres of land, okay, in this process, because it was actually given to them as an incentive. And so just to give you an idea, by the 1880s, when the railroads were built in Texas, different railroad companies that were part of this process, about 40 railroad companies received land grants, like the empresarios. In other words, there was a micro company that will say, I will build a railroad, let's say, from this community to this city, for example, point A to point B, doesn't matter. Okay, 100 miles, 50 miles of tracks, we're going to build that. Of course, it was a very slow process. This construction, project was very slow. And they were given land. And so 40 railroad companies were chartered that received all combined about 35 million acres by the 1880s. So again, it's monumental, okay, amount of land that they own, because they own 2 miles of, on each side per track mile, of course, that they built. Okay, and really, by the 1880s, 1890s, they just built about 3,000 miles of tracks. Okay, so it's a very slow process, but it's also very steady, by the way. So it is the state that is incentivizing the railroads by giving them land, for example, but also local communities in Texas were pretty much doing the same thing. They were also trying to incentivize the railroads to build a railroad line nearby their communities. So, in order to attract the railroad company to actually build you a railroad, in other words, a rail line there, or a train station, for example, so you can have access, for example, to transportation, local communities actually subsidize railroads. That is to say, it incentivizes railroads by even donating land, for example, to them. They will actually give them land there, or pretty much make those companies and their lands tax exempt, that they will not pay taxes. You're not going to be paid taxes in our community. In the land, for example, there will be no property taxes of any kinds, etc. If you have warehouses, etc., you're not going to be paid taxes. So that's very attractive for any railroad company to receive those subsidies, those incentives. That is to say, the communities will be willing to give you land, because they're ranching communities, they're farming communities, etc., that want a railroad nearby. So they're giving you land, that is to say. Okay, so by 1900, we see that Texas have built rail lines that connected certain major commercial zones or centers, that is to say, okay, like Dallas, for example, Fort Worth area, including Galveston and Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and Laredo, and there was a rail line that even crossed all the way to El Paso as well. Okay, so once again, this is the early stages of railroad construction that is beginning to. The idea is try to connect the major commercial centers of Texas, so there's going to be more trade, more commerce, and Texas is going to find also a market in the United States. In other words, you're going to now ship your product, whether it's food products or fruits or cotton or cattle, again, in order to actually, have a market in the United States. Okay. All right. So once again, the idea is, look, what is really happening at the macro level in the United States, to the integration of the Western territories with the Eastern states, to develop really a more unified national economy, a more integrated economy. The same process or the same goal is taking place in Texas. The railroads are attempting to develop a commercial and trade network. In other words, that all the local producers, and particularly starting with the major commercial centers, we mentioned Galveston, for example, Houston, which are major exporters of cotton, for example. Okay, so the cotton being produced around the Houston area in East Texas, now they're going to ship the cotton via the railroad to those international ports where the cotton is going to be exported out of the state, for example, or the cattle, for that matter, cattle that is grown, grazed, and in, let's say, places like San Antonio, Laredo, in the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas, for example, is also going to find a transportation access to the markets outside, again, particularly when you want to export the cattle or just pretty much send it to the United States, of course, for the slaughterhouses. We were mentioning the meat packaging plants, the slaughterhouses, of course, something we're going to talk about, down the line here. Okay, so again, the idea is you want to connect the local producers to the U.S. economy and also to the foreign economy. So the railroad is really facilitating that. Okay, so it's extremely important, and this is the first stepping stone, okay, for this process of change, for this process of transformation. All right, so now let's look at, we already looked at the development of a modern transportation system. Again, that is essential, it's crucial. Now let's look at the development of a commercial industrial economy. Okay, the development of a commercial industrial economy. So there's transportation now underway. Now we're going to see the modernization of Texas in terms of what we talked about again earlier in this session, is the rise of industries, the rise of new enterprises. Okay, so there's going to be a radical shift now in Texas in the way people do work and the people earn their living. Okay, there's going to be a departure, a breakaway from the traditional forms of subsistence, okay, of the past. And this new commercial industrial economy, that the Texas economy is going to be based on commerce and industry, that is to say. So in this new commercial industrial economy, people are going to be moving away gradually. Again, this shift is not overnight. Okay, it's very gradual, but it's very steady. They're going to be moving away from this subsistence economy that people are simply subsisting from their work, whether it's farm work or small family owned rancheria or ranchette, cattle ranch, for example, to now be producing for the market, working in an enterprise that the enterprise is producing a product that is being sold in the market. What is the Texas market or the national market, that is to say. Or if you're actually on land, you're a farmer, that you're going to be growing food for the market. That people are going to be orienting their work for the market, that there's a demand for certain products. And if you own land, you can actually produce those products that are in demand, or work in an enterprise or an industry that is producing that and earn wages for that matter. Yeah, that this is the way that people are going to be thinking about work. And you have to work in something that there's a demand for, that is to say. Okay, and move away from this subsistence, strategy of survival. That's okay. You can grow your own food, etc., but you're not really going to prosper very much if you're simply continuing to grow your own food, etc., be totally independent because you're growing your own food, etc. You don't depend from anybody else, etc. You sustain yourself. That's true, but remember that modernity really rejects subsistence and values more consumption. That you simply just buy what you need. In other words, why do you want to grow your own food, for example? Okay, or get a job so you can have money and actually buy whatever you want. Okay, don't be limited. In other words, there's that value on the rise. Okay, so therefore the economy of Texas is now going to be moving very steady, very gradually towards this new form of economic organization. The organization of the economy is totally geared towards the market. Okay, so let's look at, again, those commercial enterprises. Again, particularly now this is Texas, so we need to look at the development of enterprises, commercial enterprises in Texas. So the first one that has to be discussed is the most traditional economic enterprise in Texas. Okay, so by tradition, that is to say, it is agriculture. That was the way that the peoples of Texas actually sustained themselves, sustain their families. Again, the small farm. We were talking about the small farmers in an earlier topic. Okay, uh, more than anything, this is the way people subsist. Okay, there are cattle ranchers as well. I'm going to talk about that as well. But again, primarily the way people subsist in Texas was by growing their own food, a family farm. That is to say, moms and pops, etc. Okay, we were talking about that. So that traditional form of agriculture is going to change with the rise of the national market. Okay, there's now a market nationwide, so now you have consumers all over the country, consumer for food products, that is to say. You have transportation systems. Okay, you got railroads, for example. Okay, so because there's a growing demand for food products, particularly in the cities, we're talking about global migrations. How we're going to see the rise of the modern industrial cities in the United States. Now, there's going to be now hundreds of thousands, even millions of people living again in a single city. And people are working for industries, earning wages, etc. And so the question was, who's going to feed the growing population of those new industrial cities that are growing very fast as a result of those immigration patterns, etc. Farmers and foreign immigrants are pouring in into those centers. So who's going to feed them? So farmers all over the country, by the way, and in this case we're talking about Texas, saw this as a new commercial opportunity. This is a very good opportunity to make money because somebody has to feed those people again in the cities. Cities are not autonomous. They're not independent when it comes to food production. They depend on the food produced in the countryside in those farming states. They depend from the food that is coming from the outside, that is to say. So there's a growing demand for food. So in Texas, what we're going to see is that farmers now are transforming those traditional farming practices into a business, okay, a business venture. So farming itself is now going to commercialize, okay. We're going to see the rise of commercial agriculture. Commercial agriculture is also defined as cash crop agriculture. It's the same thing. Those two terms are interchangeable. Commercial agriculture, cash crop agriculture. People are simply growing food for the market. They want to grow food to make money. They want to grow food products, or they want to grow agricultural products that people are paying money, that they're worth cash, that is to say. Okay, so Texas farmers are paying attention that there's a growing demand for food products within Texas and outside as well. So they're going to accommodate to that demand, and they're going to now transform their family farms into a commercial farm. We're talking about that, the rise of commercial farms. Okay, and of course in Texas, there were individuals that promoted reforms, the reforms for a new South. They were called the New South reformers. Again, many of them were politicians, particularly that were very well versed, let's say, in economics. Okay, they were trained in economics, so they were advising the producers in Texas. They were advising the legislature in Texas, again, the policymakers, that what we needed was to transform the agricultural sector of the state. Okay, because this is now a new era. Okay, we're moving into a new era, the era of science, the era of technology, and we need to use again this knowledge in order to make agriculture more productive. To make people actually benefit from agriculture, to make money. That is to say, to make it more effective, more efficient, and to move away from those traditional techniques, those traditional forms of agriculture of the past. That we need, this is a new era. We need to upgrade, in other words, our farming techniques, our farming practices. Again, we need to reform, in other words, the agricultural sector to give rise to a new economy, This is going to be a new South, they will call it, a new South, a new Texas, that is to say. So what they were actually suggesting is that they wanted to diversify. Okay, first and foremost. Okay, so what that meant is that for farmers to be successful, they needed to make sure that if you wanted to succeed every year, and because you're now going to enter, the era of business, you're going to have a commercial farm now. This is not going to be just a subsistence farm in which you're going to subsist from the land, but you're going to make money, in other words. So what you need to do is that instead of just growing the traditional crops, let's say you were growing corn, and that's all you were doing, now you have to diversify and not just grow corn, but also grow a different number of crops, cash crops that are also valuable, like wheat, for example. Okay, so you're gonna be growing corn, wheat. You have to grow cotton as well. Devote an area of your farm to grow cotton, etc. Diversify, because the market fluctuates, and if a year, let's say, the price of cotton drops, and you're only growing cotton, what's going to happen to you? Okay, you're going to fail. So you want to make sure that if one crop fails, because you got falling prices of that crop, let's say, that you still have other crops to rely on that are still very valuable. In other words, you have corn, you have wheat, etc. Other products. You have to diversify. In other words, so they're using again an economic, analysis here of what is the best course of action for farmers to succeed. And you have to diversify, in other words, different kinds of crops, in other words. Okay. Another thing is that the new experts, the new scientists that are called again, the new scientists that are trying to reform the agricultural sector of Texas, is that you also need to engage in what is called crop rotation. Okay. Because when you simply use one plot of land for growing crops every year in a very intensive way, you'll end up depleting the soil from nutrients. Even though you can bring fertilizers and the like, that's true, but you need to rotate. It's called crop rotation. In other words, grow crops for 2-3 years, perhaps even 5 years in one plot, and then shift away and let that plot of land rest. Fertilize it, maybe move some cattle there. So it was going to actually, fertilize it, with the droppings, etc., and move it to another area. Don't stay in the same area and deplete all the minerals, all the nutrients from the land, in other words, because you're going to turn the land barren, in other words, unproductive. So you need to actually be skilled and know how to actually be able to allow for the soil to regenerate, etc. So again, we got now, advisors, we got scientists trying to bring in new knowledge, new technique about how to run your farm as a business, in other words, okay, as a business now, because now you're going to engage in mass production. Okay, this is intensive farming now, not just growing your own food for you and your family, but you need to now grow surplus grain for the market. So that requires a more intensive work, an intensive exploitation of the land, in other words. So you need to know the techniques of how to stay in business. Okay. And of course, again, scientific farming, that is to say, be able to catch up with, new developments, new knowledge, what fertilizers, you need to be using, for example, certain chemicals. You're going to be, again, moving in the 20th century with pesticides, etc., scientific farming, so catch up with the new science and trying to use the new tools of science, because, again, this is now a new business. And of course, back in the late 19th century, scientific farming involved, of course, machinery at that point. You need to mechanize agriculture. There's no way you can mass produce with traditional techniques You need to upgrade your technology. You need to invest, make some investments again in the farm, because this is now a commercial farm. Okay, this is not a family moms and pops farm. This is a commercial farm. So you need to introduce machinery, mechanize again the process of farming, the mechanization of agriculture. Okay, modern agricultural technology. You need tractors. If you don't have one, well, you need to make a serious investment in that. Uh, Borrow money. Okay, go to a financial institution. There are merchants, arriving in the South who are actually loaning money to farmers on interest. Okay, so farmers can actually purchase tractors. They're quite expensive during those times, by the way, because that's the only way you can stay in business. You need technology. In other words, fertilizers. We need constantly be purchasing fertilizers, and also once electricity arrives to Texas, once it arrives, something we're going to see down the line, by the way, is that you also need also electrical irrigation systems. Again, this is part of this new scientific farming, if you will. You need to be updated. You need to be acquiring the new tools, the new knowledge, etc., the new chemicals and the like in order to stay in business. Again, so back in the late 19th century, we got tractors that look like this. Okay, some of them plow the land, others were reaping, of course, corn and wheat, etc. And so some of them actually were propelled by horses. The first tractors, so to speak, that people acquired because they were cheaper, they were more affordable. Again, they were still propelled by animal muscle, by animal power, but nonetheless, what farmers in Texas are really doing is that this is the new era of farming. Okay, those that are not modernizing, they're not acquiring the new technologies, the new tools, they're going to be lagging behind. They're going to stay behind in that family business again. That is only going to help the family economy. They're going to live off the land, but that's it. They're not going to succeed economically. They're not gonna rise above from where they are. In other words, so again, there is now a new value, on the rise among the farmers in Texas. Is that this is the way of the future? In other words, this is the way of the future. We moving into business. We're now going to be acquiring the new technologies and the like, and we're on the way to really progress. Economically, we're going to create wealth. This is a great opportunity now, again, to create a business, to create an enterprise, and to succeed as well. There is that aspiration as well among the farmers in Texas that is gradually taking place. Okay, and so of course, besides the traditional crops that people are simply now growing for the market, the food products, for example, like wheat and corn, etc. In Texas, we're also going to see cotton. Again, cotton is also going to be the another cash crop that farmers, small farmers particularly, are going to be growing for the market as well. There is an industrial revolution taking place. The second industrial revolution, more textile industries are on the rise, not only in New England, but there's now growing textile manufacturing, textile clothing manufacturing in the South as well. And there's now a growing demand for cotton as well. So what also Texas farmers are attempting to do is grow cotton for the market, because the industries require it. In other words, they're manufacturing clothing, and they're going to use the land to grow cotton as well. There's small farm. Again, there's going to be a proliferation across Texas of cotton farms again. So it's not just food; it's also cotton as well. What that did, the proliferation of cotton farms, is that in many cases, many farmers were not really able to own land, for example, their own land, to actually create a commercial farm. So many of them were actually selling their labor for a large landowner, for an agricultural company, or for another farmer in terms of, because they wanted to grow cotton, they wanted to make money. What they were actually doing is selling the labor, trading their own labor, growing the cotton for another person, that is to say, in order to be paid with cotton. Okay, so that's another form. Again, this was known as tenancy or sharecropping. Okay, tenancy, there's a difference, by the way. Tenancy is that if there was a landowner, okay, that happened to have a large tract of land, that wanted somebody to work the land for them, he will invite a landless farmer, okay, to actually move into that land and grow cotton there. But that person will have to pay a rent, in other words, to the landowner to be in the land growing cotton. That is to say, okay, it's called tenancy. This is paid rent, in other words. You're simply renting the land, okay? You say, well, I don't have land, but I want to grow cotton, okay? So you make a deal, okay, with a large landowner for the landowner to actually award a certain plot, a certain region of his own land for you to actually work there. Okay, so you're going to work there. You're going to grow the cotton. The cotton is going to be yours, at the end of the year, but you have to pay rent. Okay, you have to sell the cotton and actually pay a rent to the landowner. That is to say, it's called tenancy. Okay, and the other form again is called sharecropping. And this is where you're actually trading your labor more directly, to use the land. So a landowner will say, here we are, I have this land, and if you move there and grow cotton for me, you keep a certain percentage and I keep the other as well. Okay, you're not really paying rent. It's just that you're working the land for me, and at the end of the year, and when you harvest your cotton, you can keep a certain percentage and you have to give me the other, of course. Okay, you don't pay me with money, you pay me with the cash crop itself, a certain percentage of the harvest. That is sharecropping, that you share your crop, in other words. Okay, again, there was a frenzy in Texas in which people thought that this cash crop was worth gold, and all you need to do is just grow cotton. Of course, there's going to be a growing decline of cotton prices, something we're going to see much later in another topic that is going to affect, of course, the cotton farms and cotton agriculture in Texas. It's something we're going to see, of course, down the line in a separate topic. But so far, we have seen, of course, the transformation of the Texas economy, because the agricultural sector is modernizing. Once again, it's modernizing because farmers in Texas are now trying to transform the land into a business. The use of the land is no longer to subsist, but to make money. They're moving into the market. They're upgrading their farms, and they're acquiring new technologies, and they're being guided by experts, that is to say, telling them how to actually run a farm as a business. Okay. For example, the crop rotation, the use of scientific knowledge, for example, and the like. Diversification, you need to diversify and grow as many types of crops, etc. And so Texas farmers are being retrained. They're acquiring a new perspective, a new knowledge of how to actually, again, make farming into a business, turn it into a business, in other words. And so, again, this is going to be very important in the modernization of Texas, something that is also going to happen in the realm of industry. There's going to be now growing industries. A kind of industrial revolution is about to take place in Texas. Again, there's going to be an upsurge of shops and industries, manufacturers, and the like, and something that we're going to see more closely in session 3. So it is really in session 3 we're going to see, of course, this industrialization project taking place, what kind of industries emerge in Texas, and we're going to, of course, examine even energy industries like coal and oil, etc. And we're also going to see the rise of big cities. The big cities in Texas like Houston, Galveston, for example, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, those industrial centers, and how people's lives are being transformed now with the rise of cities. Everything will be now discussed in session 3, the rise of industries, big cities, and the like in session 3, so we can actually continue examining, of course, modernity and progress coming to Texas. Again, something that we actually going to pick up now in session 3. That's all I have for you, and I'll see you then in session 3. Thank you.